Good evening, everybody. So glad to have you back here this afternoon for this session with Kirk Brothers. We've had a great day. There's been a lot going on this whole weekend. The Lord has blessed us. We don't want to take up too much of His time, but I'm looking forward to this lesson. I've seen the title of it, and I know a little bit about it, and I'm really excited to see how this shapes up. Here's what I'd like to do. Before we let Kirk just kind of take off, I'd like for us to get one verse of a song, Sing On Ye Joyful Pilgrims, if they're having trouble pulling that one up. It's coming. We're going to get one verse of this song, and then we'll turn it over to him. For those of you that have kiddos, just going to let you know, with the seminar and all this going, there will be no Cub Corner tonight. We will pick back up next week. We're going to introduce a new card. We're going to have a good time. Let's sing this together. Sing on, ye joyful pilgrims, Lord, lead the moment's fall. My faith is ever rising with every tuneful song. Lo, on the mount of blessing, the glorious mount I stand, and looking over Jordan, I see the promised land. Sing on a blissful music, with every note you raise. My heart is filled with rapture, my soul is lost in praise. Sing on a blissful music, with every note you raise. My heart is filled with rapture, my soul is lost in praise. Brother Kirk, turn it over to you. Preach the word.
I would like everyone to gently poke your neighbor and make sure they're awake. Because if there are teenage boys in the room and you don't use the word gently, there will be a cage match before the service is over. All right? And I'm glad you guys showed up, because just before you got here, they're fighting, okay? Exhibit A. All right. So just before you got here, the girls were saying some comment about girls rule and guys drool because they were the only ones up front. So is that a misinterpretation of what y'all said? A loose interpretation. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm convinced when you get to the judgment, you're going to stand before God, and He's going to say, did you show up at 4 o'clock? You're going to say yes, and He says, that's the big mansion section right over there. Those who just come at 5, yeah, you get a mansion, but it's a little smaller over here. Thank you for being here, and I'm excited about us having some time to spend together. If you were to go and drive along Jones Road on the edge of Bedford and Rutherford counties in Tennessee, you would come up on an old red barn on your left on some land that's now owned by a doctor. And then just past that old red barn, if you were to pull over just a few hundred yards past it and kind of walk back up in the woods, you would see an old smokehouse. And then if you kind of make a beeline straight back towards the road from that smokehouse, then and kind of dig through the brush, you would find a pile of stones that were once a part of the chimney of a house that once stood there. In a very real or symbolic sense, those stones are the foundation of my life. His name was Joseph. Joseph Madison, to be exact. But he never knew that was his name. You see, he was orphaned at the age of 5, and it was not until he passed away and the family went down to get the official records at the courthouse so that they could sign the death certificate and so forth, and that's when they realized that his name was Joseph Madison and not just Joe. He was orphaned at age 5 along with his other siblings, and he was taken in to Some of the older siblings kind of went off on their own. Others were taken in by friends and family members. Joseph was taken in by the McElroy family. Sam McElroy was an elder at the New Zion Church of Christ right there. And so they took him into their family, raised him as one of their own. And because of that, he grew up in the church, he learned about Jesus, and he became a Christian. When Joseph was an adult, he married Nora Jones. And he and Miss Nora had 5 children. But Nora died when she was 35 of typhoid fever and left Joseph with 5 kids ranging in age from 18 down to 4. Now you can add up and figure out how young she was when the oldest one was born. But he raised those children in the Lord with the help of neighbors and friends, and the second oldest boy helping with his younger sisters. And all 5 of Joe and Nora's kids became Christians. The second oldest of the 5 children of Joseph and Nora was named Leland. And Leland, when he became an adult, he married an Effie Smith. And Leland and Effie had 5 children, and all 5 of those children became Christians. The middle of the 5 children of Leland and Effie was named Joe. He was named after his grandfather. He wasn't named Joseph, even though that was his grandfather's name, because his grandfather never knew that name. It's on his tombstone, but it's a name he never knew. And so they called him Joe to honor his grandfather. Joe married a Dorothy Weiser from Lewisburg, Tennessee, and they had, you guessed it, 5 children. And all 5 of those children became Christians. And the oldest of those 5 children was named Kirk. And no, Brother Denny, I do not have 5 children, okay? I was tired at 2. So, the name Joseph is important to my family. Their story is a reminder of faith being passed down from generation to generation. And even though he had great parents, he lost those parents when he was 5. He knew Jesus because he was adopted into a family that had no blood shared with him. And I've already mentioned to you that in my family, I grew up in a family with adoptions, and my parents were foster parents. And so we grew up in a world where we have siblings and parents, etc., that have no biological ties. We have what I like to call cardiological ties. The DNA doesn't match, but the hearts do. And through an elder and his wife who had no blood connections, my great-grandfather learned about Jesus. And he passed on a heritage of faith. So if you go in my office there in Florence, Alabama, you'll find, when I sit at my desk, straight across from me, there's a 40-pound stone that came from that pile of stones along Jones Road in Rutherford County that was a part of the mantle of the fireplace of my great-grandfather's home, because it reminds me that we are all standing on the shoulders of giants. That we are who we are, and if we have faith because somebody before us lent us a shoulder and told us about Jesus. Joseph was a very common name in the first century. I mean, it makes sense. One of the great heroes of faith in the Jewish nation was Joseph, VP, Vice Pharaoh of all Egypt. I mean, he was one of their great heroes. Everybody, they told his stories at the local synagogues. And so one of your great heroes, a national hero, when you have one named Joseph, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have a bunch of children named Joseph. And so the father of Jesus was named Joseph. He had a brother named Joseph. I believe that there's a very good chance that were it not for directions from an angel, remember it was an angel that said in Matthew 1, you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. I firmly believe that had not an angel said, you name him Jesus, Jesus would have been named Joseph, because he was the firstborn son and probably would have been named after his father. Jesus was buried in a tomb owned by a man named Joseph. And this morning we talked about the replacement for Judas. Remember we said there were two people put forward. We talked about that in Bible class. One of them was named Matthias. You know what the other one was named? It was Joseph. Actually, the guy with three names. But his name was Joseph. Joseph was a very common name. We're talking today about hearts on fire, about people in the book of Acts who are on fire for Jesus. We talked about the spark in the 120 and the 12 in Acts chapter 1. We talked about a beautiful thing in the healing by Peter and John by the power of the name of Jesus, of the lame man at the beautiful gate in Acts chapter 3. And what I'd like to talk about at this hour is I would like us to talk about the other Joseph. I want us to talk about a very important Joseph, and it's not any of the ones I've mentioned. It's not Joseph in the Old Testament. It's not the father or the brother of Jesus. It's not the one who lent his tomb. It's not the one who was the apostle not chosen. It's the one that's found in Acts chapter 4. And as we look at Acts chapter 4, the biblical bullseye I want to focus on is one. One. If someone asks, what did you talk about? Then I want you to say, we studied Acts 4 and following, and we focused on one. If we look at the end of Acts chapter 4, it tells us of a Joseph. Joseph from the Isle of Cyprus. He's of Cypriot birth. He's a Levite. The tribe of Levi was the sacred tribe. They were the tribe charged with taking care of holy things. Every firstborn belonged to God. So that meant if your firstborn child belonged to God. But instead of your firstborn child going and serving at the temple, the Levites stood in the place of the firstborn, and the whole tribe served God. They took care of the sacred things. When the tabernacle needed to be packed up or put out or carried, they were responsible. They would camp around the tabernacle to protect it and to keep people from getting too close, because it was dangerous to just haphazardly walk into the presence of the almighty creator of the universe. So I think it's interesting that he came from a tribe devoted to that which is holy, because that's how he lived his life, devoted to a God who is holy. He's not only from the tribe of Levi, he's from the island of Cyprus. The Cyprus is just off the Mediterranean coast. It's a couple of hundred miles northwest of the ancient port of Caesarea. And I'll talk in a moment why I knew that distance and situation. It's an island that's roughly 138 miles east-west and about 60 miles north-south. It's a mountainous island with its highest mountain being a little bit under 6,000 feet. The Isle of Cyprus was known for timber that was used in shipbuilding and for the mining of copper. When I finished my undergrad, and if you've got any students here, I want to say, when I finished undergrad, I went and lived in Israel for the summer. I worked on an archaeology dig. I lived at Nazareth for a while, lived in Jerusalem for a while. That's a great time to travel before you make all kinds of lifelong commitments. And so I remember while I was there, for a month I worked on an archaeology dig at the ancient city of Caesarea. You know, the same Caesarea where Paul was in prison, where Philip and his daughters lived. It was the Roman headquarters, not Jerusalem. It was the Roman headquarters in Judea. It's where the Herod would have lived when he wasn't visiting Jerusalem. It's where the largest contingent of Roman soldiers would have been. One of the things you find doing archaeological work is you're going to dig up a lot of pottery, and they use pottery to date things. We had pottery experts that were a part of our team. And so one of the fun things you did at the end of the day, if you found pottery, and because we were focusing on first century Caesarea, any pottery you dug up, you had to feel like that it was close to 2,000 years old. Like if you knew it was Islamic pottery, which would have been made 1,000 years in the past, then that's not what they were looking for. But we would take that pottery, we'd put it in a bag, tag it so they knew where it came from on the property. We would wash it, and then we'd watch the experts evaluate it. And they were able to date, usually within 50 of 100 or 100 years, when that pottery is made and where it was made. So they knew how pottery was made in certain regions. They knew they could look at the substance. They could look at the purity of it. They could look at what was mixed in with the clay, all kinds of factors. And so you're constantly looking at those kinds of things. And one of the things we came across that we dug up was what was called Cypriot red slip. It was a real fine, dark red, china-like pottery that was a little better than your average plates and bowls that would have been used in people's homes and maybe the homes of folks who had a little bit more. It was made at the Isle of Cyprus. The point I'm trying to make is this island had a thriving economy. It's exporting pottery ware, it's exporting copper, it's exporting timber. So it doesn't surprise me that at this island, a guy from there ends up with money. Joseph was a man of means. Joseph is a relative of John Mark and his mother Mary. Mary was a person of means. If you read in Acts chapter 12, the story of when Peter was released from prison, the members of the church are praying at the home of Mary, a relative of Joseph. And when they got there, you found out it was a gated house. It was big enough. Remember, most houses in that area of Jerusalem, they're one-room affairs. She had a house big enough for a number of the members of the church to gather and pray. It was a gated house. You had to go through a gate to get into the main house, and they had at least one servant who worked for the family. The point is, this family came from money. And Joseph had money, but his money didn't have him. And Joseph freely shared his money with those who were in need. The economy in Jerusalem never was very good. In the first century, it was largely propped up by donations from Jews who didn't live in Jerusalem, who lived in other parts of the world in the Roman Empire, who would send funds back to kind of financially prop up the economy because Jerusalem was so important to the Jewish nation. And so you're going to find many times that they're having to take up collections. The economy wasn't strong anyway. You have famines and other things that happen. And you can think about in Acts chapter 2. Remember, after those 3,000 were baptized, it talks about they continued in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. But also, they shared their means and they ate in each other's homes. Because remember, you've got 3,000 people that are baptized. Now, some of those would have been local folks who've always lived in the area. The wording of the language in Acts 2 is that some of them used to live somewhere else and had moved to Jerusalem and were now dwelling there. And then you had a third category of people, and those were folks who were visitors who just came in for the feast. So if you've got 3,000 converts, maybe 1,000 of them are not from the area. Acts says they chose to stay. Why? Because there's no congregations back home. There's not even a how-to manual. The New Testament hasn't even been written. All the Christians in the whole world are right there in Jerusalem. And the only Bibles in existence are walking and talking and go by names like Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So they stayed in Jerusalem. But if you traveled several hundred miles or 1,000 miles to be in Jerusalem for the feast, and you only brought enough money for your trip, guess what starts happening? You get kicked out of the local inns if you were able to get a room. You don't have a job. You don't have food. You don't have housing. So how do you survive? The local people start selling land and laying it at the apostles' feet, and they start inviting folks over to their house to feed them meals. And that continued for a while. There are no other examples of where churches outside of Jerusalem had to help the Christians in Jerusalem. And that same thing is happening here. He sold some of his land and gave it to help those Christians who were in need. And the apostles gave him a nickname. We know him by his nickname. We don't know him by his given name. The nickname they gave, most of our Bible says Barnabas. It can be translated as encourager, counselor, comforter. It can even be translated as prophet. But the idea is of encouragement and motivation. And I remember thinking many years ago how cool it would be. Does anybody here have a nickname? Do we have any nicknames? You don't have to share your nickname. I just want you to acknowledge you have one, all right? So we've got some nicknames around here, all right? Could you imagine being given a nickname by the apostles? Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, to be known in the brotherhood by a nickname the apostles of Jesus gave you. And to have a cool one at that. There goes the encourager, the guy nicknamed by the apostles. But then I remember one time this sudden thought came into my mind. He got his nickname based on how he acted. So what if the apostles were riding with me when I was driving through Nashville traffic? What would my nickname be? You think about it. If they nicknamed us on how we act on a daily basis, would we like our nickname? He had one to be proud of because he lived a life encouraging other people. We jump to Acts chapter 9, and he is arriving at Jerusalem. He wants to join with the local Christians and worship with them, but they're afraid of him. Now, he's traveled from Damascus, where he was converted to Jesus, to Jerusalem. Now, we learn if we were to go over and look at the book of Galatians that, we're at least 3 years down the road. He's converted at Damascus. He goes out into Arabia. He comes back to Damascus. There's a hit put out on him. They sneak him out of the city, and then he comes down to Jerusalem. So he's been away for a while. And remember, the last time he was in Jerusalem, if you've read the story before, what was he known for? Now, this is a 4 o'clock session, so I'm assuming you can talk back. So the last time he was in Jerusalem, before he went to Damascus, what was he known for? Okay, the death. You talked about the death of Stephen. All right? He is known for persecuting Christians. And after the death of Stephen, he became the ringleader in the persecution of Christians. And so I'm finding myself thinking, he comes back from Damascus. His habit was, throughout Acts, if he came into a city, he would hunt for the local Christians. And he'd often wait around for days so he could meet with them when they met on the first day of the week, because he just wanted to connect to Christians everywhere he went. That's a great example for us. Just have the habit of wherever you live, hunt up a local group of Christians. And even when he traveled, even when he was there temporarily, he hunted up a local group of Christians to spend time with. But what I find interesting is, okay, he comes to the congregation. So here's what I picture. I told you this morning, I like in my mind to go back in time. And so here's what I picture. I picture a Sunday morning Bible class. And I picture him coming in and sitting down. And then I picture one of the young ladies here leaning over and saying to her mom, "Hey, Mom, isn't that the guy who killed Dad?" I want you to let that sink in a little bit. He would have been responsible for the arrest and death of a number of members of the congregation in Jerusalem. Now, 3 years later, he shows up for worship. Now, I want you to think about, the text says they were afraid of him. I don't know that I blame them. Is he legit? Is he just faking? Is this undercover work? Is he pretending to have become a follower of Christ so he can... Then everybody comes out of the woodwork because they think they're safe, and then he calls in the goons, and they're hauled off to arrest and death. They were scared of him. And my suspicion is that a bunch of us would have been the same way if he had hurt one of our family members. But the text tells us that Barnabas took him in. Barnabas was just a different breed. When everybody went in one direction, he went the other. When others kept their stuff, he shared his stuff. When someone shied away because they didn't know if they could trust someone, he's the usher that comes and says, let me help you find a seat and let me introduce you to some people. And he introduced him to the apostles. He accepted him, made him feel welcome, and the rest, as they say, is history. In Acts chapter 11, we find that individuals from Cyprus and Cyrene come to Antioch. So let's talk about where that is. All right, Cyrene, you see that white arrow on my screen? Cyrene is in North Africa. You may remember that a guy from Cyrene carried the cross of Jesus. Okay, so you got folks from North Africa who are involved in this. You got folks from Jerusalem. The blue arrow shows where Jerusalem was. Damascus was 150 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Antioch of Syria was 300 miles, almost straight north, maybe slightly northwest of Jerusalem. And there were a number of cities in the first century called Antioch because Antiochus was a common throne name in the ancient world, just like Candace, the queen, just like Pharaoh. Those were common throne names. And so you had a number of cities called Antioch. So you've got an Antioch of Pisidia, or you've got an Antioch of Syria. But Antioch of Syria is up there where the red arrow is. There are also people from Cyprus who came to this area talking about Jesus. Cyprus is where the yellow arrow is, and who's from there? That's where Barnabas is from. That's where his family is from, and they've got connections. So in the aftermath of the persecution and death of Stephen, you've got folks traveling all over the Roman Empire, and they begin to arrive 300 miles north of Jerusalem at Antioch of Syria. And so you have a number who begin to be converted. And this is a big deal because Antioch is the third largest city in the Roman Empire. It had 500,000 citizens. The only cities bigger were Alexandria in North Egypt and Rome itself. Now remember, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, what did Jesus want the apostles to do? You will be my witnesses where? Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and what's next? The remotest parts of the earth. If you want a subway to the remotest parts of the earth, the three best cities are Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. And you've now got the gospel planted in the third largest city in the Roman Empire with people coming in and out of it all from all over the world. Paul regularly in his preaching would go to population centers because he knew everybody from the small towns goes to the big cities. And so when the good news of Jesus ends up in Antioch, my suspicion is the apostles quickly understood the significance of that, not just in saving those people in Antioch, but the role that church could play in literally taking the gospel to the remotest parts of the earth. And so I can picture them and getting together and saying, okay, they need encouragement. Who could we send to encourage these people? Didn't we nickname somebody the encourager? And that's what they did. They chose Joseph the encourager, and they sent him there. And then notice what the text says when he got there. Is it verse 23? He began to live up to his name. That's not what the text says. The text says he began to encourage them. He lived up to his reputation. In chapter 11, verse 25, it tells us that Joseph the encourager decided apparently that he needed some help with these Christians and churches in Antioch. And so he remembered apparently a young man he met many years before, over a decade before, down in Jerusalem, who showed up to worship and everybody was afraid of him and he welcomed him in, a young man from Tarsus. And apparently after the events of Acts 9, Saul, as he was going by at that time, later to go by the name of Paul, had gone back home to Tarsus in Cilicia. And that's where he's been ministering and preaching Jesus. And it so happens that while Antioch is 300 miles north of Jerusalem, it's only another 100 miles up to Tarsus where Saul is. So he goes up to Tarsus, he gets Saul, brings him back to the church there at Antioch of Syria. they begin to working together as some of the preachers and teachers in the congregation. You get to Acts 13, and the leadership of that church decides to send Joseph the Encourager and Saul out on what we call the first missionary journey, and the rest is history. One more example. I want us to look in Acts chapter 15. You're at the end of the first missionary journey. They've converted people and established churches in multiple cities and at least 3 different Roman provinces as they've worked on the Isle of Cyprus and in Asia Minor. So when they return from that first missionary journey to report back to the church that sent them out, Antioch of Syria, when they report back to that congregation, then some individuals from Jerusalem who used to be Pharisees before they became Christians, they happened to be visiting Antioch and hear about these new Christians and converts from these Gentile communities, these non-Jewish communities that Joseph the Encourager and Saul visited on the first missionary journey. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, you've got to circumcise all these people. And so there was this big disagreement over whether or not new Christians, they weren't questioning whether you should believe in Jesus and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. They were just saying, circumcision is the sign of a relationship with God. It's been that way for 1,000 years. So surely, being a Christian, you still have to do that. And so Joseph and Saul disagreed, and they had a huge discussion about it, and rightly concluded, based on Scripture input of the inspired apostles, etc., that you do not have to be circumcised physically to go to heaven. And at the end of that, then Paul says, let's go back and visit the churches from the first journey. He wants to go back and check up on them. Joseph the Encourager is all for that, and it seems that things went well till they started putting the mission team together. Now, if you've ever put a mission team together, for that matter, if you've ever put a VBS together, it can be an adventure. And so, as they're thinking about who's going to be on the team, you can just imagine Joseph saying, oh, I'll give John Mark a holler. Y'all use the word holler here, don't you? Okay, I'll get you a Southern dictionary if you don't know what that is. But he says, I'll reach out to, is that better? I'll reach out to John Mark and I'll invite him. I don't know how that happened, but Joseph wanted John Mark to join them on the second journey. It's his cousin. Of course he wants him to go. But Saul, who by this time is going by his alternative name Paul, his Latin name Paul, doesn't want to have anything to do with it. Because John Mark had gone with them on the first missionary journey, but right after they left Cyprus, he wimped out and went back home. I don't know why, but remember, he came from money. And my suspicion is, when you're traveling with Paul on a mission trip, you're not staying at the Ritz. And in whatever reason he decided to go home, Paul did not think it was a good one. And we're reminded of something that I see in deacons' meetings all the time. You have a bunch of awesome people in the room who love God and are passionate about service, who have different priorities and different areas of focus. The deacon of education, guess which work he thinks is the most important work of the church? The deacon of benevolence, guess what he thinks is the most important work of the church? The one who's in charge of coordinating who leads in worship, guess what he thinks? The one who is head of evangelism or missions, guess what he thinks? They're all good people, they just have passions and priorities in different areas. Both Joseph and Paul loved God and wanted to save the world. But they have different personalities and different priorities. Paul is that militant, all-in, I don't have room for wimps on my team because I'm trying to save the world guy. So a guy who uses up funds and then quits and goes back home to mama, he doesn't want that guy on his team. But Barnabas is the second chance guy. And I could just imagine the conversation. Saul's like, I don't trust him. I think he'll use our money and quit and go home again. And then I can imagine Joseph saying, well, what if I'd have had that attitude about you when you showed up in Jerusalem at church on that Sunday morning? They just had different priorities and passions, but they both loved God. So what they ended up doing is dividing it up. You take your team and go that way, and you take your team and go that way, but the job's going to get done. And so what happened is that Paul and Silas went up through Cilicia, where Paul was from, and visited the churches closest to where he was from. And Joseph took John Mark and went to Cyprus. Why do you think they chose that island? They've got family. They're checking up on their family members. And so it made sense what they did, and they didn't let their disagreement stop their work. I want you to think about just those 4 examples. You have Christians in Jerusalem who no longer went hungry because of the sacrificial attitude of Joseph the Encourager. You've got Paul, who would mentor Timothy and Titus and Silas and plant churches all over the Roman Empire. What if there had been no Joseph the Encourager to greet him on that Sunday morning? Or what about John Mark? The John Mark who we think wrote our Gospel of Mark. And I wonder how many people since then have become Christians because they read the Gospel of Mark. Would that book have a different title in our Bibles if Joseph the Encourager had not insisted we give him a second chance? And what about that church at Antioch? It was not so much the church in Jerusalem, it was mostly the church at Antioch that was responsible for the salvation in Jesus message going to the remotest parts of the earth. Because they were a church made up of people from all over the world, and because they were diverse, they understood that there were people all over the world that needed Jesus. Do you think maybe Joseph the Encourager, who was one of their first preachers, might have influenced their attitude towards evangelism and shaping the world? Could there have been a different future had there not been a Joseph the Encourager? I chose to build this lesson around a guy in the book of Acts. As I looked through the Bible, I could have talked about Hannah or Esther or several of the Marys. There are many great women of faith that I could have chosen to focus on. It's not about a male-female thing. It's about a giving my heart up to God thing. It's about saying, God, here's what I have, here's what I can do. You use it however you want it. You want my money, you can have my money. You want me to go to this new congregation and teach, I'll go. You want me to leave everything I've known and go to places I've never seen before and risk my life? I'll go. Whatever you want, I'll do it. That was the attitude of Joseph the Encourager. He is literally one of my heroes. He's one of the most important people in Scripture. And I want you to think of the impact that that one person had. There was a meeting in this house, the old home of T.B. Larimore, great restoration preacher. In that home in 1965, in November, there was a gathering of local church leaders, and somebody at that meeting said that we need a Bible college in Florence, Alabama. That statement, and I don't know who said it, led to the charter of what was then the Southeast Institute of the Bible. On March the 9th, 1968. What's interesting is I was born in May of 65. I had no idea in 6 months of age, when I was 6 months old, there were a group of men gathering in that house that would make a decision that would impact my life. One person with a dream, voiced it out loud, led to what I do every day. One person can make a difference. If this one guy we've talked about, if God could use him to do all that, what if everybody in this room really gave themselves up to God? I'm not talking about just showing up, checking in, sitting down on our cushioned pews in our climate-controlled room. I'm talking about all in, it's all yours, I'll go where you want and do what you want me to do. What if we all became Josephs? Imagine what could happen in Bear Valley. Imagine what could happen in Denver. Imagine what could happen in this state, in this country, in this world. Be the one. Be the one. Be the one. Who is going to be the one that says, God, all I am and all that I have is yours? If he can use Joseph, it doesn't matter what your name is. He can use you. Would you bow with me? Our Father in heaven, thank you for people like Joseph who help us to see not what we can do, but what you can do. Help us to have the courage and the compassion to let go. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, brother, so much. It's good to be here today. Good to get this encouragement, and you have encouraged us in so many ways this weekend. We're looking forward to one more lesson from Dr. Brothers in just a little bit. We are about 20 minutes out from 5 o'clock, so here's what we're going to do. Let's just enjoy the break for a little bit. We'll have several that come in the next handful of minutes, and then at 5 o'clock we will get started with our evening worship assembly. So consider yourselves dismissed for the time.